An old man in a wheelchair caught my sleeve in a hospital hallway in San Antonio and whispered that he needed me to pretend to be his son, just for 10 minutes. And I sat down, and I did it. And 11 months later, his real son walked out of a courtroom on Fort Sam Houston with no rank, no pension, and nobody left in this world who would look him in the face. Hold up, one thing before I take you back there. Where are you sitting right now? What city? What little nowhere town? Whatever it is. Go drop it in the comments for me, because I keep those, and I read them out loud, at the top of the next story. And yours might be the first name out of my mouth. And thank you for giving me this time today. I mean that. People like you are the only reason this channel is still standing. So if you've got a like or a subscribe in you, I'll take it and I'll be grateful. Okay, so it was a Tuesday in October, still 80-something degrees outside because this is South Texas, and October means nothing here. And I was walking the third-floor corridor of a hospital off Wurzbach Road in my dress blues, which I hated, because dress blues in a hospital make people look at you. And that day, I did not want to be looked at. I had a manila envelope under my arm. Remember the envelope? That's the whole thing. And this voice off my left side goes, "Sir, sir," real quiet. There was an old man parked against the wall between a supply cart and one of those blue signs with the arrows on it. Wheelchair. Blue blanket over his legs. Brown jacket with an American flag patch sewn on the shoulder, crooked, like somebody's wife did it 30 years ago and never fixed it. Ball cap that said, "Korea Veteran," with the little ribbon bar stitched on the front. His hands were shaking, not nervous shaking, the other kind, the kind that just lives in your hands after 80-something years. I stopped. You stop. That's just what you do. He looked up at me, and he looked at the stars on my shoulder, and he did this thing where he tried to sit up straighter in the chair, and it hurt him, and he did it anyway. And I swear that's the part that got me before he even opened his mouth. He goes, "Sir, I know this is a strange thing to ask a stranger." And I said, "Go ahead." And he said, "Please, just for 10 minutes. Pretend you're my son." I said, "Say that again." He said it again, and his voice came apart in the middle of it. He said there was a meeting, 2 o'clock. The social worker and the doctor and the discharge lady, all of them in a room. And it was about where he was going to live, and they'd already asked him twice if any family was coming, and he'd already told them twice that his son was on his way. He'd been telling them that for a while. He said it real fast, embarrassed, like he was confessing to something. And then he said the line I still hear at 2 in the morning sometimes. He goes, "If nobody comes, they write down that I don't have anybody. And then they send me to the place out past Converse, and my wife's buried the other direction." That's what he was scared of, not dying. The direction. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Walter." "Walt." I said, "Walt? What's your son's name in case somebody asks me something?" And he got this look on his face, little flinch, and he said, "They won't ask." So I said, "Okay, I want to be honest with you about something, because if I skip it, the rest of this doesn't make sense." I did not say okay because I'm a good man. I said okay because my own dad died in a room in Killeen with a Bible he couldn't read anymore on the nightstand while I was on my second tour, and my sister sat with him, and I did not. And there is no rank they can hand you that fixes that. So when an old man in a Korea cap asks you to sit in a chair for 10 minutes, you sit in the chair. I pushed him down the hall. He told me which room. He'd counted the doors. Now the meeting. There were 4 of them in there. Social worker named Yolanda, young doctor, discharge planner with a laptop, and a nurse who kept looking at her watch. Yolanda saw me come in behind the chair, and her whole face changed, and she said, "Oh, you must be Greg." And Walt said, "That's him." Just like that. Fast. like he was afraid I'd correct her. So I shook her hand, and I said, "Sorry, I'm late." And I sat down. And for the next 40 minutes, not 10, 40, I sat there, and I found out things about that man that his own blood should have known, and clearly did not. I found out his hearing aid had been dead since June, because nobody had gotten him batteries, and he'd just been nodding at people for 4 months, so they wouldn't think he was slow. I found out he'd come in through the emergency room after a fall, and there was no shoes in his belongings bag. A man comes to the hospital with no shoes. I found out his last address was a facility off Bandera Road that Yolanda described, very carefully, in that flat voice people use when they can't say what they actually think, as a level of care that did not match his needs. And then she pulled up the chart and she said, "And it looks like your visits have been consistent, sir. We've got you down here as visiting Sundays." And I said, "Ma'am, could I see that?" She turned the screen. There it was. Family contact, son. Weekly. Walt was looking at his hands. I said, "When's the last Sunday I came, Walt?" He didn't answer me. He just kept looking at his hands, and his thumb was going back and forth over that spot on his knuckle where he'd got a scar. And he said, real low. So only I could hear it, he said. They only put it in the computer because I told them to. He'd been lying to a hospital computer for 8 months, so the staff wouldn't feel sorry for him. That's the kind of man we're talking about. And here's where my stomach dropped out. And here's where this story actually starts. The nurse leaned over to scan his wristband for something, and I read it upside down, the way you read anything upside down, without meaning to. Sawinski, Walter G., and the envelope under my arm, the one I'd been carrying around all day like a dead rat, had that same last name typed on the second line of the first page. Let me back up. I have to back up, or you'll be lost. My name is Dan Merrick. At the time I'm telling you about, I was a Major General, 2 stars, at Fort Sam Houston, which, if you don't know, is right there inside San Antonio. It's not out in the middle of nowhere, like people picture. It's got neighborhoods on all 4 sides of it. 29 years in at that point. Divorced, 1 daughter at Texas State, a house in Shirts with a dead lawn, and a garage I kept meaning to clean out. Part of my job that fall was sitting on a promotion board. Colonels going up for Brigadier General. 1 star. And if you've never been around that world, let me just tell you, that jump is the whole ballgame. Most colonels never get it. It goes to a board, and then a list, and then that list goes all the way up, and eventually the Senate confirms it. And until every one of those doors opens, a man on that list is the most careful human being alive. 11 days before that Tuesday, an envelope showed up at the Inspector General's office on post. Handwritten address. No return. Inside was 1 page, also handwritten, and a photocopy of a bank statement with 3 lines highlighted in yellow. The page said, in a young person's handwriting, that Colonel Gregory Sawinski had been taking his father's money, that the old man was in a home he didn't pick, that the colonel had not visited in over a year, and the last line said, "He tells everybody he takes care of his dad. Please check." No signature. Now, I need you to understand how these things normally go, because this part matters later. Anonymous complaints about officers up for promotion are a dime a dozen. Somebody gets passed over. Somebody's wife hates somebody's wife. And boom, hotline complaint. The IG shop sees 100 of those. And Sawinski, on paper, was gold. Ranger tab. 2 deployments. And the thing his whole file was built on. The thing every one of his evaluations mentioned. The thing that was in a glossy profile piece somebody wrote about him. Was this beautiful story about a colonel who moved his aging Korean War veteran father to San Antonio to care for him personally. There was a photograph in that profile, the colonel in his uniform with his arm around an old man in a Korea veteran cap. I had that photograph in my envelope. That's why I was in that hospital that Tuesday. I wasn't there to be anybody's son. I was there because the complaint listed a facility, and the facility said he'd been sent to the hospital, and I wanted to lay eyes on the old man myself before I signed a piece of paper saying there was nothing here. So I sat in that meeting in dress blues, playing the son of a man whose actual son I was supposed to be pinning a star on in 4 months. Yeah, I know how that sounds. Sit with it a second, because I had to sit with it for the length of that drive home on Loop 410, and I thought I was going to be sick in my own car. When the meeting broke up, I wheeled him back to his room, and I helped him into the bed, and he weighed nothing. Nothing. And he said thank you about 6 times, and then he said, "You didn't have to stay for the whole thing." And I said, "Walt, is your son named Greg Sawinski?" And that old man's face went white in about half a second, and he grabbed the bed rail, and he said, "Don't. Please don't. He's got a big career, and I don't want to be the thing that messes it up." I said, "Sir, has he been to see you?" And he said, "He's real busy." I said, "When?" And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "He came at Easter." And then he thought about it, and he corrected himself, which about killed me. He goes, "No, wait, that was the Easter before." 2 years. 2 years, and this man was still covering for him with a hospital computer. I drove home, and I didn't turn the radio on. Okay, so here's what I did next, and here's where it went sideways, because it did go sideways, and it went sideways bad before it ever went right. I could not touch it. That's the first thing. I was on the board. I had read this man's file. If I so much as breathed on an investigation into a colonel I was voting on, his lawyer would eat me alive, and the whole thing would get thrown out as unlawful influence, and I'd be handing him the exact gift he needed. So I did the correct thing. I wrote a memorandum. I recused myself from the board entirely. I turned over the envelope, and I asked for a formal inquiry. And they gave it to a colonel named Rick Bard. Rick Bard and Greg Sawinski went through the academy together. Same class. Bard had been a groomsman in his wedding. I did not know that at the time. Nobody told me. It's not like there's a chart on the wall. Bard closed that inquiry in 11 days. 11 days. I have seen inquiries into a missing set of night vision goggles take longer than that. His report said the allegations were unsubstantiated, that this appeared to be a family financial dispute, that the colonel held a valid, durable power of attorney executed by his father, and that the father, when contacted by phone, confirmed he was satisfied with the arrangements. By phone. The man's hearing aid had been dead since June. I read that line about the phone call standing up in my own kitchen, and I had to put the paper down on the counter and walk out to the driveway and stand there in the dark for a while. And that was supposed to be the end of it. Complaint closed. Sawinski's name stayed on the list. There was a date being talked about for the ceremony. Spring, at the quadrangle on Post, with the peacocks and the deer and the whole picture book of it. And I heard from somebody in a hallway that his people had already asked whether they could get the old man there in a wheelchair for the photos. For the photos. They were going to wheel that man out of a facility he hated, sit him in the front row, take pictures of a sun pinning on a star, and then wheel him right back and forget the batteries again. That's the day I stopped being careful. Now, I still couldn't investigate him. That never changed. But there is nothing on God's earth that says a 2-star general cannot visit a Korean War veteran in a hospital. So that's what I did. Every Sunday, Wurzbach Road, 3rd floor, and later the rehab place off Fredericksburg, and I brought him hearing aid batteries and a pair of black orthopedic shoes from the store on Bandera that I got the size wrong on twice, and I listened. Because here's the thing about old soldiers. They don't tell you the important stuff when you ask. They tell you sideways, on a Sunday, when the game's on, and neither one of you is looking at the other one. Walt was 17 when he lied about his age, and went in, He was at the Chosin Reservoir. If you don't know what that is, look it up sometime when you've got the stomach for it, and understand that he was a kid in canvas boots at 30-something below zero, and that the reason his hands shook was not just his age. He came home. He worked 41 years at a plant out on the east side. He bought a little house in Terrell Hills in 1968 for $11,000. He buried his wife Marta at the National Cemetery in 2017, and he had one son. One. And he was proud of him. God, he was proud of him. He'd tell me about Greg making major, Greg making colonel, and his whole face would come up out of itself, and he'd be a different man for about a minute and a half. And then, one Sunday in December, he said something and didn't even notice he'd said it. He was talking about his hip surgery, the one from about 3 years back, the one that put him under for 4 hours at the hospital on the northeast side. And he goes, "That's when they moved my accounts." I said, "Who's they?" He said, "Well, Greg had to. I was out of it." I said, "Walt, did you sign something?" And he said, "I must have. I must have." Here's the wild part. He'd never seen it. He had never once laid eyes on the durable power of attorney that Colonel Bard's report called valid. He just assumed. He assumed the way you assume about your own child. And I want to tell you I cracked it wide open that week, but I didn't, because I couldn't. I had no standing. I had no authority. I was a man bringing a stranger batteries. What broke it open was a 22-year-old girl in scrubs. Second Sunday in January, I get to the room, and there's a young woman sitting in the chair I usually sit in. Nursing student at the university out on the northwest side, and she's got her grandfather's hand in both of hers. Walt goes, "This is Emily," and then he goes, "General, this is my son's girl." She looked up at the stars on my shoulder, and I watched the color go straight out of her face, and she said, "Oh." And I said, "You wrote it." And she started crying so hard she couldn't get air. She'd found it the previous summer. She'd gone looking for her grandfather because her dad kept saying he was fine. He's fine. He's at a great place. Don't bother him. He gets confused. And she went anyway. And she found him in a room the size of a walk-in closet, sharing it with a man who screamed, in shoes that weren't his, with a cap that was the only thing in the room that belonged to him. She'd copied a bank statement out of her father's home office, mailed it, heard nothing, assumed nobody cared. Then she told me the rest, and I want to lay it out for you plain, the way it eventually got laid out in a courtroom, because this is the part where it stops being sad and starts being a crime. 1. The power of attorney. Dated the 4th of a month, notarized, witnessed. Walter Sawinski's signature right there on the line. Except on the 4th of that month at the time stamped on the notary log, Walter Sawinski was on an operating table with a breathing tube in his throat, getting a hip replaced. Anesthesia records. Time in, time out. That paper says he signed at 11:40 in the morning. That man was unconscious from 9:15 to 1:15. 2. The notary. Woman named Denise Krall. She worked the front desk at a title company off Broadway, and she also happened to be the sister of Sawinski's wife. Family. She stamped it and she wrote it in her book, and she never met Walter Sawinski in her life. 3. The money. Walt's disability compensation from the VA, plus his Social Security, plus the pension from the plant. All of it got redirected into a joint account he never opened. $1,900 and some a month, month after month, for going on 3 years, going into an account that paid a truck note, a country club initiation, and tuition at a private school in Stone Oak. 4. The house. That little brick place in Terrell Hills that he bought for $11,000 in 1968, sold for $435,000. Walt thought it was rented out. He used to ask about the tenants. There were no tenants. There hadn't been a house for 2 years. 200 and something thousand of that went into a remodel with a pool. 5, and this is the one that made a retired sergeant major stand up in the back of that courtroom and have to be told to sit down. There's a shop on Broadway that buys and sells military collectibles. Old uniforms, patches, medals. On a consignment slip dated the March after the hip surgery, somebody sold them a silver star, a Purple Heart, and a Korean service medal with a battle star, along with the original citation paperwork with Walter G. Sawinski's name typed on it. $350 for the lot. $350. He sold his father's silver star for less than what he spent on a set of tires. Now, Emily had photographs of documents on her phone. She had a video of her father at Thanksgiving telling her uncle that the old man doesn't even know what day it is anymore. And she had her own eyes. And I took every bit of it, and I walked it straight into the office of a woman I trust more than almost anybody, a colonel in the legal shop named Adriana Farrow, and I said, I need this to go to Army CID, and I need it to go somewhere Rick Bard cannot reach. And Adriana looked at it for about 4 minutes, and she said, Dan, I need you to understand what's going to happen to you. I said, what? She said, this man has friends. You already recused. You have now been sitting in a hospital room with the complaining witness every Sunday for 4 months, bringing him gifts. Do you know what a defense counsel does with that? And I said, tell me anyway. She said, they're going to say you coached him. She was right. Boy, was she right. 2 weeks later, I got called in and informed that a complaint had been filed against me. Abuse of position, improper relationship with a witness, attempting to influence a promotion board I had removed myself from. I got flagged, which means everything stops. No moves, no schools, no nothing. And there was talk about whether I should be temporarily reassigned out of anything to do with personnel. And the complaint came from a retired lieutenant general named Arthur Kessler, Sawinski's old mentor. Sat on a couple of boards for a defense contractor out on the north side, had his name on a scholarship fund, still got introduced as sir by men in their 50s. I sat in a windowless room for 2 hours, answering questions about hearing aid batteries. They asked me for the receipts. I had them in my truck, in the console, because I never throw anything away. $19 and change at a pharmacy on Nacogdoches Road, and I had to explain to a lawyer why I bought them. And I remember hearing my own voice say, because he couldn't hear the television, and thinking, this is what my career is going to end on. And that was February, and the promotion ceremony was set for April, and I genuinely believed I had lost. I want you to know that. I'd swung and I'd missed, and I was going to have to watch that man pin on a star while his father sat in a wheelchair in the front row, wearing shoes I bought him. And then it got worse. Because on a Friday afternoon in late February, a petition got filed in Bexar County Probate Court. Colonel Gregory Sawinski, applicant, seeking guardianship of the person and estate of Walter G. Sawinski proposed ward, on the grounds that the proposed ward suffered from cognitive decline, was being unduly influenced by third parties, and lacked the capacity to manage his own affairs. You see what he did there? You see it. If that petition went through, Walt is legally a ward. His son controls where he lives, who sees him, and here's the kicker, whether he can go anywhere or testify to anything. Every single thing that man had said to me becomes the confused rambling of an incapacitated old veteran. And the phrase undue influence by third parties, that was me. I was the third party. He was going to lock his father in a box and use my visits as the lid. I called Adriana at 9 on a Friday night, and she picked up. And I said, we lost. And she said, no. Now he made a mistake. I said, how? She said, because a guardianship in this state is not a rubber stamp. The court appoints an attorney ad litem for the proposed ward. independent lawyer whose only client is Walt. And the court requires a physician's certificate of medical examination. Independent doctor. She goes, "He just handed us a judge." The doctor saw Walt on a Tuesday morning. Geriatrician, no dog in the fight. Saw him for an hour and 20 minutes. Walt gave him his service number from 1950. Gave him the name of every man in his fire team. Told him the date, the year, who the president was, and then told him, and this is in the certificate, word for word, that he understood he had lost the ability to walk, but had not lost the ability to think. And then the attorney ad litem, a young woman named Priya Raman, who could not have been more than 32, sat down with Walt for 2 hours and came out and filed something with the court that was not a formality. She contested it. She asked the court to look at the power of attorney. She asked for an accounting, and a judge in Bexar County ordered an accounting of every dollar moved under that power of attorney for 3 years. That's the day the floor came out from under Greg Sawinski, and he didn't even know it yet, because he was busy getting fitted for a uniform. The guardianship petition got denied in March, denied flat, and when a court denies you and orders an accounting in the same breath, and CID already has anesthesia records sitting on a desk, things start moving very, very fast. The flag went on him in the 3rd week of March. His name came off the list a week later. And I want to tell you about the day the charges got preferred, because I was not there. But Adriana was. And she told me he asked twice whether this would affect the April date. The April date. Charges in his hand, and he's asking about the ceremony. The court-martial was that August at the courthouse on Post. Larceny, false official statements, frauds against the United States, because he'd also been claiming his father as a dependent parent on his paperwork, drawing money for supporting a man he was actually draining, and he'd filed travel claims for trips to care for his father. On 4 dates, he was demonstrably in Cabo San Lucas with his wife, and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Walt did not want to go. "I need you to know that," he said. "That's my boy." Up until the very end, he said, "That's my boy." What changed his mind was the medals. The investigators had gotten them back from the shop on Broadway, and the day before trial, a CID agent sat down in Walt's room with a plastic evidence bag and asked him to identify them. And Walt held that Purple Heart in his shaking hands, and he turned it over, and he looked at the back where the engraving was, and he said his wife had polished it every Memorial Day for 49 years. And then he said, real quiet, he said, "I'll go." The courtroom was small, wood paneling, flag in the corner. Emily testified in the morning. Her father sat there in his uniform with all his ribbons on and stared at his own daughter, and she could not look at him. And when the defense counsel asked her whether she was angry at her father, she said, "No, sir. I'm his kid. I love him. That's why I mailed it." I have never heard a room go that quiet. The anesthesiologist came next, and it was maybe 11 minutes of testimony, and it ended the trial. Trial counsel put up the notary log, big screen, and then put up the surgical record next to it, and just asked, "Doctor, at 11:40 in the morning on this date, could the patient have signed his name?" And the doctor said, at 11:40 on that date, the patient could not have breathed on his own. Denise Kral had already cut her own deal by then. She took a plea in state court on the notary fraud, lost her commission permanently, paid restitution, and she sat outside the courtroom on a bench that whole day with her purse in her lap and did not go in. But the part I'll take to my grave is the afternoon. They wheeled Walt in after lunch. He had on a suit that hung off him and the Korea veteran cap, and the bailiff went to tell him to take the cap off, and the judge said no, and that's all he said, no, and everybody understood. Trial counsel asked him about 6 questions. Simple ones. Do you know the accused? Did you ever sign a document giving him authority over your money? Did you know your house had been sold? And on that one, Walt said, No, sir. I did not know that. And then defense counsel got up to cross him, and you could feel the whole room brace, because what's he going to do? Is he going to go after an old man on chosen reservoir hands in front of a panel of officers? And he tried. Gently, but he tried. He asked about memory. He asked about medications. He asked whether the general, meaning me, had ever discussed the case with him. And Walt said, He brought me batteries. Defense counsel said, Sir, I'm asking about the case. And Walt said, I heard you. And then that old man turned his head, and he looked past the lawyer, right at his son. And he said one thing that wasn't an answer to any question that had been asked, and nobody stopped him. He said, Greg, I would have given it to you. All of it. You only had to come ask me. His son looked at the table. Guilty. All of it except one specification of the travel claims. The panel came back in under 3 hours. Dismissal from the service, which for an officer is the same thing as a dishonorable discharge, and it takes everything with it. Total forfeiture. Restitution. 14 months confinement. 26 years of service turned into a sentence, and a number and a bus. He wanted a star. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing he ever wanted. And the way he tried to get it was by selling a story about being a good son. And it cost him the rank he already had, the pension he'd already earned, his wife, who filed in October and got out clean, and his daughter, who has not spoken his name in front of me since. Colonel Bard got looked at hard for that 11-day inquiry. He didn't get charged. He got a general officer memorandum of reprimand, permanent file, which in that world is a bullet to the head, and he was relieved, and he retired that winter as quietly as a man can retire. And Kessler. Retired Lieutenant General Arthur Kessler. His complaint against me got closed out as unsubstantiated in June, and I got unflagged, and I never got so much as a sorry, but there was a dinner that fall, one of those things at a hotel on the River Walk, and I was standing near the bar, and he came in and worked the room the way those men do. And I watched 2 colonels I know turn their shoulders on him. Just turned. Didn't say a word to him. And that man stood in the middle of a ballroom full of people who used to fall over themselves for him, and he had nobody to talk to. And about 40 minutes later, he got his coat. The contractor let his board seat lapse in the spring. They put out something about strategic realignment. Everybody knew. Walt got his money back. Not all of it. You never get all of it. A house that's sold is sold. But the court set the power of attorney aside as void from the start, and the VA cleaned up the fiduciary side, and between restitution and what was left, there was enough. He lives about 9 minutes from me now. Little place off Nacogdoches, 1 story, ramp out front. And there is a wall in the front room with a shadow box on it that Emily had made at a shop on Austin Highway. And the silver star and the purple heart are in it. And she polishes them at Memorial Day now because Marta can't. He had a stroke in February. Small one. He came back most of the way, but not all the way. And here's the part I don't have anything clean to say about. Sometimes he calls me Greg. Not always. Most days he knows exactly who I am, and he gives me hell about the shoes I bought him and how they were the wrong size twice. But some evenings, when it's getting dark and the game's on and he's tired, he'll say, Greg, hand me that blanket. And I hand him the blanket. I don't correct him. I'm not going to correct him. You can call me every name in the book for that if you want to. I've thought about it more than you have. I think about that hallway a lot. 10 minutes. He asked for 10 minutes. He had gotten so low that 10 borrowed minutes from a total stranger felt like something worth begging for, and he still apologized for asking. So look, if you've got somebody, an old man, an old woman, Somebody who used to be the biggest thing in your life, and now they're just a phone call you keep meaning to make. Make it. Not for them. I mean, yes, for them. But you're going to be the one sitting in a truck in a parking lot someday doing the math on how long it's been. And that math does not get better. He asked for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I'm still there.